Welcome to CYP Now's big debate on children's social care commissioning. I'm delighted to welcome our three guests: Leonie Cowan, who's a local government legal consultant at Leonie Cowan and Associates; Harvey Gallagher, the CEO of the National Association of Fostering Providers; and Johnathan Stanley, Director of the NCERCC. Sorry, Johnathan, I'd forgotten the really long version of the name. Sorry.
The National Centre for Excellence in Residential Childcare.
Thank you very much indeed. Johnathan, you've done some kind of early thinking on this and kind of scoped out what you think regional commissioning, regional care cooperatives, which will manage the commissioning process under the government's proposals. You've done some thinking of what they might look like. From what you've done, from the work you've done, do you think that RCCs will deliver those two kind of main aims?
I suppose I would be sceptical that they're going to, and I'm sceptical at the moment because, like you in your introduction, I'm not quite sure what we're discussing here, and I welcome the idea from the ADCS that the DFE has a rethink about what they're going to be doing. I think the rethink could be slightly stronger and be a pause. But to address, for example, how collaboration. Well, collaboration is different to working relationally. It's not just a question of administration when it comes to children, but we have to talk about values, and there have to be common values between the local authorities and the providers, and they've got to be aligned. And make sure there's no compromise and we're working from consensus. If the idea is that we're to work with a broader range of providers, more questions start to tumble out. Broader than what? Broader than the current regional lists. Local authorities source locally, regionally and nationally. So is the ambition to be able to meet all the needs in the region? We've never done that in our entire history, so this will be a remarkable step forwards. And if we are, then it's going to need audits of need and planned provision. That's difficult if you've got market forces, and it's not something that we've previously done. And then finally, although we call it commissioning, in fact, it's probably procurement, and we've never really had commissioning where we've looked at the needs of children and being able to find the sorts of homes and resources we need to do them. So if the question is in regional care co-ops is how to achieve commissioning, good. But if we're just rearranging the deck chairs, that's not something which is going to get us any further forwards than we are now, I think, unless anybody else disagrees.
No, I would like to agree, and I would like to add something to that. At present, local authorities each have their own commissioning strategies. They may partly work collaboratively together, but you can have 2 or 3 local authorities within a very nearby geographical area, which logically would be part of the same regional collaborative, but they won't necessarily address commissioning, i.e. the strategic planning, in the same way, and they won't even necessarily address purchasing, i.e. procurement, in the same way. So I think there's a fundamental question that Johnathan has highlighted that I would like to add to, which is the intention that each of these regional collaborative commissioning consortia takes responsibility for the commissioning away from the local authority, and therefore takes responsibility for the sufficiency duty as well? Or is it literally an extension, a statutory extension of the current purchasing collaborative consortia, which are the procurement consortia? Until we understand those fundamentals, which is one of the fundamentals that the ADCS have identified, which is you split the commissioning from the procurement, rather like splitting the rail tracks from delivering the railways. You have this disconnect between responsibility for the customer or the child and responsibility for the means of delivery.
For that, both of you. do you think that's something, Leonie, just on that point about whether to split up the commissioning and procurement, and that kind of tension between a regional body and the responsibilities that they're going to have, and the individual authority and its own responsibilities and where they might fit together? Is that something you think might possibly be tested out in one of the or both of the pilots? Maybe a different approach being taken on by each?
Well, I hope so, because if that question isn't answered, I don't see how we can have a reorganization of the whole of commissioning or purchasing, because actually, if you take away the responsibility for commissioning from the local authorities, I think you then have to go that next stage and take away the responsibility for the sufficiency duty and create a different legal entity, which is your regional collaborative, which is responsible for children. And then if you read some of the information about it, are they also going to be delivering the services as well? Is there a confusion in some of the papers and some of the stuff online that I've been reading about being a deliverer and being a commissioner and a procurement entity? Because I see the two as really quite different, and somewhere you have to say, well, if they are responsible for delivering services, e.g. they build residential homes, e.g. they recruit foster families and manage those foster families, then we have this tension between them saying, well, I'm going to place in my home or my foster family exactly the same tension that we have at present in local government, which is, are we looking at the needs of the child coming first, irrespective of the type of placement or the type of cost? Or are we saying that this is a cost functional service? The objective is to reduce cost. So it doesn't really matter. All children look the same. That's why we have standard costs. Which seems to me entirely wrong. It's just not how we are, and not how we provide for the sufficiency duty or the needs of individual children.
Harvey, if I could bring you in here, but going back to the kind of two key aims, as it were, of these reforms, from a kind of a foster care provider's point of view, do you think they would welcome the idea, IFAs, this is independent fostering provider agencies, would welcome the idea of perhaps working with fewer commissioners on this kind of regional basis? Would that be something that you think that they would welcome? And do you think that would make it by definition a more efficient way of kind of commissioning and finding care placements?
Well, regional commissioning of foster care has been around for 10 or 15 years, so it isn't new. And everything Johnathan and Leonie have described are both the symptoms and the root causes of how we've ended up where we are. So it does seem to me to be slightly curious that you'd want to do more of the same to address some of the problems that have been caused by the way you've been doing it for the last 10 or 15 years. So I suppose the answer is yes and no. Yes, actually, if there was some more coordinated approach to how IFAs were working with local authorities to offer foster care for their children, that would be a good thing. Is that what we're expecting? So what is it that RCCs will do over and above or different or special that hasn't been happening already? Because there's been enough of a history of it that we've seen every combination of everything tried, different footprints of local authorities, some dipping in and dipping out, dynamic purchasing system, frameworks. All these things have been tried over and over again, and none of them have really worked to address sufficiency or needs or spending. So what's different? So is forced cooperation the answer? And I mean, I think part of the issue is that RCCs are going to be tied up with these other things. So there's a transfer of the direct delivery of the local authority's own services, the foster care they deliver in-house, for instance, to the RCC. Is that on the cards? Is the governance some brand new legal entity? Is it akin to regional adoption agencies? And I think what Josh McAllister set out and what the government has set out on the response doesn't give us enough detail to understand why will this do something that's different to what we've already tried. So I think that's the problem with it. But I also have to say funding is a huge problem. You can't ignore the elephant in the room that the whole sector has been underfunded for a long time and continues to get worse. So to some extent, you can fiddle with the architecture and you might get a little bit more out of it that way. But unless it's combined with a significant injection of money spent in the right way, of course, it isn't just about money, because you can spend money badly, of course, then it's difficult to see how this can't work without significantly more investment than government have promised to go along with it.
We'll come back to funding in a moment, if that's okay. Just on the point about collaboration, you mentioned, as you say, and CYP now has written for a number of years about kind of various regional frameworks that have been existed for some time, some with success and perhaps some with less success. But I suppose that essentially requires collaboration to be at its heart for that to work, and between both providers and authorities. As you say, it's mixed results where that's been tried. What do you think has been the root cause of that? What is it? Is it simply going on to your second point about a lack of funding? There's not enough funding in the system.
It isn't just that, no, but clearly it's a huge problem. I think there are two issues. One's kind of cultural and one's practical, really. From one perspective, if RCCs take responsibility away from local authorities, so local authorities can no longer choose to not collaborate, then that would force them to collaborate, because clearly every local authority is an island entire of itself with its own political accountability, and they can sort of do what they like. And there are many, many times where they do choose to do what they like, even though it makes no sense to me. But I can't stop them doing that, because they can do it if they want to. So I guess that's one of the problems. It's the downside of localism. Localism gives you the opportunity to make silly decisions sometimes, and so there is a bit of that going on. The other side of it is that local authorities see the independent sector as competitors, except the competitors actually at an advantage in some ways, not a disadvantage in others. So until local authorities genuinely see the independent sector as somebody they not only should, but have to collaborate with, because actually not only is that in the best interest of children, but it's the best way of spending the money, then I don't think that will change either. And I see no strain of thought running through regional care cooperatives that there'll be a particular role for the independent sector, other than we'll come to you when we need to spend some money on you. And that's just doesn't get us any further forward at all. We genuinely need to acknowledge that the independent sector actually offers really good care, overwhelmingly really good care for children at really good value for money. And until we accept that, then we're not really going to move forward in understanding how that all fits together to deliver the best of what we can with what we've got.
Gotcha. Thank you. Johnathan, I was going to ask you to come in there, if that's okay. Does Harvey's description of the situation with IFAs, with fostering, is that mirrored, do you think, in what you see in residential childcare?
Well, yeah. However, I think, not rather than a but. However, I think that there's the commissioning experiment and using market-based provision. What it hasn't been able to meet all needs, and so we still have some young people whose needs are not met within the regulated sector, and they're being placed into the unregulated sector. So we know that the funding and the way we have it at the moment, and the relationships don't necessarily work for all children, and something else is needed. Now that isn't necessarily part of the regional care co-ops, and I'm not quite sure how low incidence and low numbers, high incidence and low numbers is going to work. And there's an enormous amount of reconciliation and mediation which is going to be needed, almost a psychosocial organisation or consultancy between providers and local authorities. There's a history here, and it's not purely an administrative move from one to the other. So I don't think that the idea is being radical enough in its thinking and incisive enough, and really have thought through the implications and the consequences. And part of that is to only have it in 2 regions. Well, simply residential care doesn't work in having only 2 regions. It doesn't work regionally. It works locally, regionally, and nationally. We've got to tease out the relationships that exist. For example, some providers do not provide placements within their region because of history that exists. And are they now going to be, as Harvey said, forced into cooperation? I suspect they might choose not to, and they might want to close, or they want to move, and then we've lost the limited amount of residential care that we have in this country compared to other countries.
So perhaps do you feel there's perhaps a quite a narrow definition of what good sufficiency have we on define, looks like within the reforms and within some of the thinking currently?
I think part of the radical thinking is to do away with sufficiency.
Right.
I think sufficiency leads towards numbers, and I think we have to get into a much more radical thinking about specificity, which is about meeting need. And that means we've got to do some audits of need regionally and nationally, and to aggregate them and think about what it is, where we want it, and who's it for. But really get down to some specific thinking. And if we don't do that, we're just going to have regional care co-ops, which are going to be heads on beds. And nobody wants that, surely.
Can I just come in and add to that, but on a slightly different aspect? If
Please
we
do,
are
Leonie,
saying as a society that under the children legislation, the whole range of legislation, there is an obligation to consider the needs of the child, and there is also this fundamental obligation to consider the needs of the child within their existing family and other relationships, and therefore all of the talking and the thinking is that most children ought to be near to home. If you have, instead of local commissioning, which you can choose as a local authority, can choose to go into a regional consortium, how is a region, a bigger region, going to encourage the needs of the individual child wanting to live within their family environment on the assumption that you take a child or young person into care, not forever, but surely the objective is to rehabilitate. So therefore, as Johnathan says, in a free market economy, we have a free society. Suppose providers then say, well, actually, we don't like the look of the whole of this regional commissioning consortium because we actually don't want to work with it, because we would prefer to work with a different one. The risk is that, well, at present, we all know that there are some areas of the country that are net importers of children from other areas. In a regional environment where there is only the one option, if that is indeed what is developed, the risk is that there will be regional deserts. And I see that as a massive, massive risk that
Leonie, could you expand a bit on what you mean by regional deserts? Do you mean that there's kind of certain regions where there simply won't be any provision, or certain types of provision?
Yes, because the people in the providers in those regions say, oh, I don't know, I can make a placement with a better region where we feel that the relationships are much better, rather like, I suppose you say dentists. We don't choose to have our business in that region. We don't choose to open our service to this particular region. And then what happens? And then, supposing there is a region that is obliged to, the local authorities are obliged, if this is what happens, by the way, to put all of their commissioning and purchasing within a particular regional consortium, but that isn't very good. Who has the power, who has the influence, who has the ability, the responsibility to change the service, the quality of the care, the quality of the commissioning and procurement in that region? And I can see that we've talked about what these regions might or might not look like, but I think we actually need to have a proper risk analysis of what the risks are of going into this regional commissioning.
It does feel like the way you've just described as well, that it's this kind of contradiction within the in the fundamentals really of the reforms of, as you say, a creation of kind of regional bodies that were going to do this, but there's very much the emphasis on local placements, and that does seem to jar, doesn't it?
Yes, exactly. I mean, there is an argument, and I would posit it because this is a wide-ranging discussion, for actually removing regional commissioning and purchasing, except for particularly specialist services, and actually going in the other direction. The government should be encouraging localized relationship building, relationship with local providers, etc., etc., based on collaborative partnerships, based on numbers of placement, because at present, for example, in residential care homes, the state of the market, very recent report by Revolution Consulting shows that 97% of residential care placements are on spot individual purchases. It's an incredibly high percentage, whereas in reality, we know that many local authorities and providers have relationships that go outside the principle of a spot purchase. Why isn't this enshrined in better relationship purchasing?
Yeah.
There is a question that nobody has asked you, and this is that, so for foster care, every local authority has got other local authorities' children living with IFA foster carers in their area. Why? Why has nobody asked that question and come up with an answer for it?